So, appreciate everyone coming out for this one. This is going to be by far the oddest Bible study in the history of Bible study, and that's after we've already set a really high standard for bizarre Bible studies. We are totally outside of the book at this point, but in 20 years of seriously studying the Bible, I've gotten off on a few, one or two different rabbit holes here and there, and I end up studying the weirdest things. I've gotten obsessed with quantum physics, or I guess quantum mechanics. I've gotten into languages, Greek and Hebrew. I've gotten into history and more than anyone should ever want to know about the Roman Empire and the Greek Empire and Middle East history. But this is by far the biggest, I guess let's call it, this is my obsession when it comes to rabbit holes and Bible tangents. And I think there are very few people that would ever even make the connection on the two, but it's been probably 10 years of obsessively studying and reading everything that's pretty much ever been printed on the subject. And so I'm confident it'll be off the wall, but I am also pretty confident that you'll walk away from it either not caring a bit about the entire subject or being obsessed for the rest of your life. There's one or two reactions. There's really no middle ground. And so I will jump in and I'm also probably going to not be able to take questions until the end of this one, just because I'm going to try to fly through what's probably 10 hours worth of stuff in an hour. I actually have 79 slides and we're going to make it through them all. So, yeah, better for you if we don't do questions, I suppose. So the Great Pyramid, this, I can guarantee you no one's ever made it out of probably even middle school without having heard of the Great Pyramid. And then there's maybe a handful of people that I've ever met in my entire life that gave it a second thought since then. It is not where Tutankhamun's discovery of his tomb was that was in all your textbooks. There has literally never been anything interesting that's ever happened during our lifetimes, or probably the 25 preceding lifetimes at the Great Pyramid, and no reason you would ever think of it other than to have studied the ancient world wonders. You've heard it mentioned then. You saw it on Despicable Me when Gru stole it, and that's probably the most thought you've ever put into it. And like I said, I've probably got 5,000-6,000 hours worth of time into this, just absolute rabbit hole after rabbit hole after rabbit hole, and you can spend your entire life studying this one structure and still not know all there is to know about it. And that seems like a wild claim at the outset, and I can promise you by the end you'll probably at least see what I mean. Obviously I think everyone realizes the Great Pyramid is in Egypt. It's just outside of Cairo in a place called Giza, and it is one of 3 pyramids on the Giza Plateau. The common reference to it is Khufu's pyramid, and then there's another one called Khafre and one called Menkaure. You will almost always see pictures of Khafre when you hear about the Great Pyramid. It's the one with the pieces still on top with the stones here in the middle. See if I can get my pointer going. Laser pointer. So this is Khafre. You're familiar with seeing the top. And even when people talk about the Great Pyramid, almost always they'll use pictures of that. But it is not the Great Pyramid. That is the second pyramid. The Great Pyramid is Khufu, and it is the first one. It's the one without a top on it. It's at the base of the Nile Delta. So Egypt is absolutely barren except for about the upper 10%. That's the Nile Delta basin, where it's very fertile, and the Nile branches together off of a series of smaller tributaries into the single Nile, and that area of Egypt is pretty fertile. The rest of it is absolutely atrocious. And as we talked about before, it is one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, and that's probably the only place you've ever heard it referenced other than maybe tourism magazines. It's by far the oldest of the seven wonders of the ancient world in to a magnitude of about 2,000 to 3,000 years before any of the prior. It is by far the largest, and even though it appears to be a stack of stones, I can assure you it is by far the most intricate and incredible piece of work that we have on the planet, and the only one of the seven wonders still standing. I'm going to get off my pointer here so I can click through. All right. So, what is the Great Pyramid? I'm going to just kind of read this excerpt from Encyclopedia just real quick. The pyramids erected on the Rocky Plateau on the west bank of the Nile in northern Egypt in ancient times were included among the seven wonders of the world in the ancient ruins of Memphis, in the ancient ruins of the Memphis area. The designations of the pyramids, Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure, correspond to the kings for which they were built. The northernmost and oldest pyramid of the group was built for Khufu, Greek Cheops, the second king of the fourth dynasty, called the Great Pyramid. It is the largest of the three in length and base. So all common knowledge will teach that it is a tomb for a pharaoh that was dead in the fourth dynasty around 2300 BC. You will not find deviation from that in any textbooks, in any Egyptologist notes. It is called the tomb and tomb only theory, and it has been held for a long time by the Egyptian authorities and everyone that has a say in it, that this was nothing more than the tomb of a long dead pharaoh. And that is very important to the story. I don't think you'll need a reminder, but that's the basis of everything here. The article goes on to say that Khufu reigned for about 40 years, and the Great Pyramid was built over the course of about 23 years or 21 years and then planning. And that also is worth remembering. The Great Pyramid looks like this today in the top left corner. When it was first built, it looked like the bottom left corner. The interior stones that you see today were originally covered by casing stones that were made of white limestone. And that is a piece of the white limestone that has broken away about, the limestone covering had broken away in an earthquake in about 1300s. And then basically the Egyptian authorities used it as a quarry, stripped all the white limestone away, and used it to build mosques and temples. So there are only one or two small sections of it where you can see the white limestone, and there's probably about 5 or 6 blocks. So I dug down when we were there underneath the blocks and broke away a piece, and that has been my souvenir, and is probably the most precious thing I own, and it's a stone. But it's a stone that was crafted about 4,000 years ago, and to a level of precision that we're going to get into here shortly. So you see, what you see today is incredible. What you can imagine, what's described in Josephus' writings, Herodotus, who's considered the father of all history, he described seeing the Great Pyramid as a beacon of light. It was purely white in the sun, reflecting in the sun, and one of the features that we're going to talk about actually caused it to draw light in. And so people talked about being able to see it from hundreds of miles away because it actually pulled the light into the center. And you'll see why that is, but it's just absolutely incredible. And the dating that just about everyone's agreed on is right around 2500 to 2400 BC. So just putting that in a frame of reference for the Bible, that is pre-flood, in between Noah's ancestors, and easily the oldest structure known on planet Earth. It is absolutely enormous. It is the weight of the Great Pyramid is equivalent of 14 Empire State Buildings. It is an unbelievably massive structure. It's 450 feet tall, which means it's about twice the height of the Statue of Liberty, half the height of the Eiffel Tower, and all of that weighing close to 4.6 million tons. So this is absolutely, you cannot appreciate how enormous the Great Pyramid is until you've actually stood by, and we'll do some pictures. brought the VR. There's an app on the VR that allows you to do travel, and you can go stand in front of it in 3D and just get a scope of how big this thing is. The first time we put that thing on, I literally was just like blown away. I mean, yeah, and I still go on and just check that it's still cool every once in a while. A disturbing number of times I get on there just to look at it. But let's see, the base of it, just in area, the base of the Great Pyramid covers about 15 acres. So if you can imagine, I mean, a normal country plot of 5 acres, 3 country plots, 18 football fields, this thing covers. It is, when I say enormous, it is absolutely enormous. So here's just for frame of reference, that's Moriah by the base course at the bottom. It is very, very big. Each one of the courses is about 4 to 5 feet tall, right? And made of solid limestone bricks. There are 2.3 million limestone blocks that make up the base of this thing. 2.3 million. The average weight of those is 9 tons apiece. So 14,000 pounds is the average weight of the limestone blocks. 2.3 million of them make up the building. The granite blocks that make up the interior, some of them weigh upwards of 80 tons. That is an astronomical feat to move. We have very few cranes. There are about 10 cranes in operation in the entire United States that are capable of moving 80 tons today. That is an enormous amount of weight. And there are probably 60 of those blocks that make up the interior and some of the features of the inside. There is enough stone in the Great Pyramid to build a wall around the earth 4 feet tall. That is just to give a little perspective. So yes, it is very, very, very big. It is one of 2 structures that can be seen from space. This is a picture from the International Space Station, including the Great Wall of China and the Great Pyramids can be seen from space. So it is huge. I'm hoping we don't need to spend more than 5 minutes establishing that concept. We've got in our minds, this is big. But that's kind of just the beginning of why this is incredible. Bearing in mind, this was built at least 4,000 years ago. And in a time when they supposedly had sticks and rocks as tools and hand shovels and saws. You go to the Egyptian Museum of Antiquities and they have a display that shows these are the tools that were available to be used. And I've got a picture of it later. And it is quite literally rocks strapped to sticks and that level of tech. And that's what most authorities would claim was used in the building of the Great Pyramid. Okay. Now, this starts getting a little more incredible. The Great Pyramid, over 15 acres, is level to 2.3 inches, is the highest deviation over the course of 15 acres. It is perfectly level, 4,000 years after it's being built. That is within the tolerance for building a skyscraper today. And that's up to 40 stories you can be within 2.5 inches of level. So this thing is more level than most modern skyscrapers that are being built. 4,000 years after construction, and it covers 15 acres. It's built, the reason it's still level after 4,000 years, it is built on socket joints. A 8.5 million ton structure is built on socket joints. Each of the corners has an underground limestone socket that allows it to pivot in 4 different directions. This is so far, that technology wasn't used in building commercial buildings until the 1800s. We didn't earthquake buildings by building socket joints until the 1800s. This was done 4,000 years ago. And it has allowed it to withstand earthquakes, floods, and stay level to less than 2.5 inches across the entire base. The technology that goes into making something that size be able to pivot and shift, you cannot possibly comprehend the mathematics that it would take to calculate the shifting of that much weight to keep it balanced and not collapsing. It is not a 4-sided pyramid, as you might imagine. It is actually 8-sided. and it wasn't even discovered until the 1700s when we discovered flight, that it actually had 8 sides, and there were pictures taken from the top. You can see the sides. It's actually built in a concave fashion to add stability and strength, but when it had that outer casing of limestone, the effect would be that light would reflect inwards. So instead of refracting, it reflected inwards to create a beacon effect. It's built on that level of precision. It has 8 sides and perfectly concaved. It's aligned to the cardinal directions to a greater degree of accuracy than the Paris Observatory for Space and Science, which is our standard of measurement for north, south, east, and west. It is perfectly aligned. It's off by, after 4,000 years, magnetic north moves. After 4,000 years, it's off by less than 1.4 minutes of separation. And so it is incredibly well aligned to magnetic north at a time when that concept was supposedly not even known. It is each of the rises, so bearing in mind, it's an 8-sided pyramid. It's not a 4-sided pyramid. So each rise, each run, the greatest deviation in length of base, length of side, length of center seam, any of the exterior lines is 3.7 inches. Not feet. It's 750.64 on one side and 0.67 on another side when you measure out to the casing frame. It is perfectly sized. And when I say perfectly sized, that is astronomical to accomplish with steel today. And we're, once again, talking over the course of 15 acres with limestone and 4,000 years of settling. And it is not off by more than 3.7 inches in any single one of the parallel lines. It has no measurable variance in angle on any of the rises. They are 51.84 degrees of rise each on 4 sides, not 51.85, not 51.83, and this is talking with stone. They are precisely aligned in rise and run 4,000 years after construction. No measurable variation. That's all the normal stuff. Okay, that's just like facts that nobody can dispute. That's not even speculation, those are measurements. That is a building that's 4,000 years old that we think of as just a heap of stones, and it's attributed to a pharaoh as his tomb during his lifetime. Okay, so here's where I will lose you for certain, and feel free to get up and leave if we get into heresy here. The Great Pyramid is a scale model of the Earth in a 1 to 43,200 ratio. And the reason it's 43,200 is because we're using feet there. If we use the standard by which it was built, which we'll talk about later, is a form of the cubit, it is a 1 to 10,000 or 15,000 ratio across the entire, in 26 different measurements. I'll go through a few key ones. It is a scale model of the Earth. What's even more bizarre, Isaac Newton understood that. Before we were able to calculate the size of the Earth, he sends his assistant to go and measure the Great Pyramid because somehow he knew it was a scale model of the Earth and that he could determine the size of the Earth, both the polar axis and the polar radius, by measuring the Great Pyramid. No one knows how he knew that, but it is a matter of record that he did, and that he sent his assistant to try to ascertain the size of the Earth by measuring the Great Pyramid, and also was under the belief that he could determine the distance from the Earth to the Sun and the Earth to the Moon by doing various measurements on the Great Pyramid. And this is not a crackpot. This is Isaac Newton. And no one, it hasn't been, there's no record, and I've tried to find it for 10 years on how he knew, what is it he was looking at, but it is undisputed that he did. The Great Pyramid is as I said, the base, the equatorial circumference. So the base times 4,000 or 43,200 gives you the Earth's equatorial circumference, not plus minus to our foot now that we can measure it. And it is incredibly precise at a time when there would have been no possible way of knowing the Earth was even round. We didn't know we thought it was flat until Columbus. They built a scale model of the Earth 4,000 years ago. with incredible precision. And the same thing with the height. The height of it is its polar radius, so that you can see that it creates a rhombus of the Earth. And so it's a scale model that you could measure the Earth by knowing that ratio. The entire pyramid is constructed in 12 different ways. The primary one is the entire size of it and its shape, contemplating the ratio of pi. Pi wasn't discovered until the Greeks about 3,000 years after this was built. Its entire basis is built on the calculation of pi. And so there's a mathematical problem called squaring the circle. They were able to solve the problem of squaring the circle by using the ratio of the Great Pyramid, because it's a triangle that uses pi, which is the circumference of a circle. So it's an incredible mathematical feat that wasn't even fully understood until past the Greek period of rhetoric and logic. The interior of it stays, and this is, keep in mind, in the desert in Egypt. The interior of the building maintains a standard temperature of 67.5 degrees year-round. That is the mean temperature of Earth's that's the mean temperature of planet Earth over the last 100 years that we've been recording it, at 67.5 degrees. Despite being 110 degrees outside, this thing stays the same temperature. The total surface area of 92,110 is the distance to the sun. That one's a little wonky. That one you can pick holes in because you're having to use two different measurements. You're using the meter versus the kilometer. So it's really like a 100-to-1 ratio. But this building contemplates that number. And the only reason that's incredible is that's a very specific number. It's not just a round number. The gross weight of the Great Pyramid times 10 to the 6th power is the estimated gross weight of the Earth in mass. It is a model of the Earth in so many ways. The coordinates of it, on our geographical grid, are 29.9792458, and the speed of light is 299,792,458 milliseconds. Some of these might be coincidences, and a lot of people will start picking holes in these and saying, well, it's actually slightly off. We've actually measured it. It's actually half a degree off of north of what it's stated. But either way, you start putting these together, there's something going on. I don't care how creative you try to be with your arguments. You can pick apart any one of these you want. You can pick apart any 5 of these you want. There is still something incredible going on with a 4,000-year-old building that exudes all of these attributes that it shouldn't have, right? There is something. It's not nothing. Is it everything? Is it concrete evidence of some supernatural force? No. Is it nothing? Can you convince yourself that all of those things are just coincidences and that this was built by a prehistoric people that really didn't know much more than sticks and stones? You have to go one way or the other. I know which way I lean, and I leave it to you to lean whichever way you want. But those are just, and I'm not joking, Adam Rutherford made a 4-volume set that's over 2,600 pages on just bizarre attributes of the Great Pyramid. Not talking the 3 pyramids, this is just the one, the Great Pyramid. And it is a 4-volume set. There are libraries of books written on this structure because there are so many anomalies that shouldn't exist with what we know of history and man's capabilities. So, in order to keep moving, I am going to do a very, very quick interior tour to demonstrate that not all pyramids are created equal. We got the chance to go in 2021, and we went and saw the Great Pyramid, and then we got to bribe someone to rent the Great Pyramid for 2 hours at 3 in the morning. And so there are areas of it that have been closed off to the public for like 100 years. And we got to go down in them and just like got free reign of the place to crawl around. And it was my absolute dream. And so it was incredible. And that was long after I'd already been obsessed with this. And so when I went, and it was absolutely incredible. These are some interior diagrams of the primary pyramids found in Egypt. Other than the second pyramid, which is Khafra, that's attributed to the 4th dynasty. The rest of these, the layer below, the 2 layers below on the left-hand side, are from the 5th and 6th dynastic period of Egypt, so following the Great Pyramid. And you can see the quality of construction has gone down a tad. Then you start getting into the right-hand page. Those are all they're more modern as they go in and as they descend here. So they either, there is something different about these, or they had the ability to create marvelous works and then forgot, because the rest of them are all in rubble. Notice also the corridors, the passages to these pyramids. There is not a single one that passes through the structure. They are all into the ground. They are holes into the ground, if you look at the picture, and then the pyramid is built on top by stacking stones. Contrast that with the Great Pyramid, which has unbelievable interior components. This is a map of the interior of the Great Pyramid. It is not only passing through, it is built all throughout in an incredible, elaborate set of tunnels that go in and out, and chambers that are just incredible. So to start, and I'll just kind of do this as a pop through, we'll do this just like a really quick tour. So you enter through, there's a new hole in the front of it that's called Mahmud's Tunnel. When I say new, I mean it was done in 800 AD by a guy named Al-Mahmud, who was one of the first, let's call him, is Caliph Mahmud, but he was one of the first emperors of the Arab states when they took over Egypt. Egypt is historically not a Muslim state. It was conquered and taken over in about 1000 AD, gradually before that, but it officially became an Arabic state at that time. And so this Mahmud saw the pyramid, decided to go in and do some treasure seeking, and basically burrowed a hole in the front of it. He had heard rumors of a door, but the door was so well hidden with the limestone facing that he started digging 10 courses below it. It was hidden from view, and you can see up here in the picture, the top is the actual entrance. It is a giant gabled entrance, but it was hidden by the limestone. Mahmud starts digging below and happens to intersect with the first tunnel. So when you enter the pyramid, you enter through Mahmud's tunnel because the main entrance is closed off, it's sealed. I have no idea why, but you go in that way. So you go in, and the first thing you're looking down is the descending passage. The descending passage is the equivalent of about 3 football fields straight down in half of the angle of the exterior of the Great Pyramid. It goes down at 21 degrees perfectly throughout and descends into a chamber that's about 200 feet below the bedrock of the Great Pyramid. So about 8 million tons sitting on top of the bedrock, and they dig a tunnel that goes all the way to the bottom, and you end up, and this is going down it. It was obviously not meant for large people, but we crawled down the whole thing, and you end up in what's called the lower pit, or the bottomless pit, and it is just a rough corridor that is insanely creepy. That was one of the areas, this whole tunnel, that's been closed off to the public, so we got to go crawl down into this pit. And it's the only unfinished portion of the pyramid, and right in the middle of it's called the bottomless pit, and it's a hole that sinks down. The last measurement was about 226 feet into the bedrock. And so a giant hole right in the middle of this subterranean corridor that's unfinished. Okay, so that's the lower area. When you go up to the upper area, the chambers to the upper side are blocked. They're blocked by what's called the granite plug. And it is a giant piece of cut granite that's about 40 to 50 tons, and it was built into the spot. So it was never meant to be accessed. This was not a plug that was placed later on. It was built in to the ascending corridor, and that blocks the way. So the only way you get into it is Al-Mahmud's tunnel goes around it. and you head into this ascending passage. And the ascending passage is just a very narrow climb that starts moving upward from the descending corridor. You go up about 100 yards, and then you get to the Grand Gallery. The Grand Gallery is absolutely incredible. It's corbelled ceilings that are about 20 feet tall, and you walk into it, and it is just a giant open hall that goes another about 100 yards or so, continuing up. But after having crawled to get through those tunnels, you get into that, and it is incredible and enormous. As you stand looking up at the Grand Gallery, you can go underneath the Grand Gallery, and you can see this little tunnel. That was another area that's closed off to go to what's called the Queen's Chamber. And it's the smaller of two chambers that are within the main structure. They give them the title the King's Chamber and the Queen's Chamber, obviously, because they hold the position that these were meant to be tombs. The important thing to note, as you look at the inside of the Queen's Chamber, and this will become a theme, there is nothing. There is not a mark. There is not a adornment. There is not a hieroglyph anywhere. You will not find any markings on the inside of the Great Pyramid other than one scored line down one of the tunnels that's perfectly cut into the stone, and one recessed boss on one of the stones in the entire pyramid. There is no adornment, no decoration. It is perfectly bare. So this picture on the right is the inside of the Queen's Chamber, and it's about, it's 20 by 20. It's a square room about 20 by 20. Once you go up the ascending corridor, or you go up the Grand Gallery, you get into what's called the King's Chamber. The King's Chamber, the most important thing to notice is we have changed stone. The entire King's Chamber is made of red granite. It is cut. Look at how closely the stones fit and how smooth the walls are. That's granite. In a time when supposedly they're using rocks tied to sticks, you don't cut granite with rocks tied to sticks. It's one of the hardest rocks. It's one of the hardest materials known. It's cut with diamonds. We use diamond cut blades to cut granite. This is cut to incredible precision, and it is incredibly. It's glass along the side. You couldn't slip a piece of paper between any of the stones. The one piece of furniture in the entire Great Pyramid is this box that you see in the King's Chamber. It is the only adornment of the entire thing, and it's called the coffer. And the standard assumption is that it was a burial tomb, yet there has never been any evidence that anything was ever buried in it, and no markings of any kind to indicate that. And once again, it's cut out of a single piece of red granite, and it is carved in a box that is so precise. I'll get more pictures of that later. But it's bigger than the doorway to the room, so it was built in the room. It was never meant to leave. It was not carried in. The door to go in is this big, and it is big enough that I could lay down in it. So that's just the fastest tour of the interior of the Great Pyramid, and it does it no justice. There are over 2,300 feet of passages through limestone, bedrock, and granite. The largest measured deviation, side to side or up and down, in any of the chambers is less than 2 inches. That's not counting breakage of rock from people taking chunks out of it. That's the actual true measurement. It does not vary. Not one of the tunnels I just showed you varies by more than 2 inches, side to side or top to bottom. You couldn't do that with modern lasers. You can't cut stone over that distance with that precision with the technology we have today. I don't mean like it would take time and it would be difficult. You cannot do it over that length of time, or over that distance. It is an impossibility with the technology we have. The measured deviation on the angles of each of the corridors is disappointing compared to the outside, which was perfect, because there is one angle that is 1/18th of a degree of deviation off of perfect, off of exactly precise with the rest of them. That's insane precision for the interior of this stack of rocks. Okay? So, was the Great Pyramid a tomb? Is this a tomb that was built for a pharaoh during his lifetime, presumably by slaves? There's something we're missing. So, just to go through some things that you all know, these, when you just Google Egyptian tomb, this is the Google search. That's what the interior of every single Egyptian tomb that they've found that has grave markings or mummification, they are covered with stories of the dead, people that were sacrificed along with them, things that they needed for the afterlife. It is a very ritualistic culture, and they were obsessed with documenting the achievements of the people that were being buried. The interior, this is two common examples of interior surfaces of tombs that were found. These are the life stories of the pharaoh. This is the interior of the Great Pyramid. You're telling me that this person was such a megalomaniac that they built themselves the largest structure in human history over 450 feet by 750 feet and didn't even put their name in there, in a culture when the pharaohs before and after them wrote their entire life stories on the insides of their tombs. There is not a marking to attribute this to anybody in the entire building. Also, why did they bury the dead? Why was the important Egyptian culture? Because they believed the body had to be preserved in order to pass into the afterlife. So they went to elaborate lengths to preserve the body, to hide it, to booby trap these areas so that they would be resurrected and their bodies would not be disturbed. That's why they're constantly digging and uncovering ones. This is not well hidden. That, if you're trying to go into the afterlife without being disturbed, I think you're going to be found. That's completely contrary to their intent and their purpose for burying the dead. They knew that would invite grave robbers. They made doors on these buildings. They had doors. The intent was not to keep people out, right? It was not to hide a body. The king's chamber and the queen's chamber have ventilated shafts that go to the surface. I'm not sure how much experience you have with dead people, but one thing I do know is dead people don't need air. These are ventilated. They keep flowing air. There is a current system so that you could live in there. It's not, you wouldn't do that through that many chambers. The difficulty of digging a straight air chamber through almost 200 feet of stone is not worth it if you're putting a dead guy in there. This is Khufu, or Cheops. This is the pharaoh that was attributed the Great Pyramid, and only on the basis of finding a marking on one of the exterior grave sites for his mother, was buried in a tomb that was located around the Giza Plateau. And they found a marking and had no other, there was at the time no possible speculation on who the pyramid would be attributed to. So historically, it was just attributed to Khufu. What's really funny to me is Khufu means God could protect me. He was son of Sneferu. Sneferu is actually one of the more famous figures in Egyptian history. She was a very well-loved queen, is his mother. He is believed to have had 3 wives. He is famous for building the Great Pyramid at Giza, one of the 7 wonders of the world. But apart from this, we know very little about him. His only surviving statue, ironically, the smallest piece of Egyptian royal sculpture ever discovered at 7.5 centimeters. The only other thing we have that evidences this guy's existence is a cartouche that has his name, so a hieroglyph that has his name, a statue that is this big, and a wonder of the ancient world that's supposed to be attributed to him. So this guy was such a megalomaniac that he built himself a wonder of the world, but never had a statue made of him, other than something that's the size of a teacup. Like, some of these things just start getting silly when you start picking them apart. That's not how their culture worked, and that's not in any way consistent with the type of person that would build that. On top of that, at the Cairo Museum, It's now not available for viewing. There is what's called the inventory stela, which is the way they kept records. Egyptians were obsessed with keeping records. There is a written record of Khufu's initiative during his reign to restore and clean up the Sphinx and the Great Pyramid. You do not restore and clean up buildings that you built. It was a public works project, and it describes the effort they went to clear sand away from the base of the Great Pyramid and to unbury the Sphinx. This was, the inventory stela very clearly says these were in existence during his time and had been so long that he felt the need to clean them. And yet they just say, no, that must have been a forgery. That's the answer to the inventory stela, is that must have been a forgery, and they take it off display. No other explanation, no other justification. It's just, that can't be right. I can't imagine that can't be right. Then there's also the very minor problem of math. There are 2.3 million stones in the Great Pyramid. As we said, let's average them at 10 tons apiece. Divide that by 20 years of construction. That means you are dropping a stone every 2.4 minutes, day and night, for 20 years, and you built the structure we just described before. Every 2.4 minutes, you're putting a stone in place. If you've ever even laid brick, you know you're not doing it at 2.4 a minute in a normal bricklaying situation unless you're an expert. And they supposedly did it like this, using these tools, and made that in 20 years, 2.3 million stones at 2.5 minutes a stone. That doesn't even build in time to design the thing, to plan it, to quarry the rocks, to get them on site. That means you started laying stone the minute that 20-year marker and continued every 2.5 minutes until the guy died. That is not good math. So why are they so fervently into the tomb theory? Why is it held so deeply, and why are people attacked so adamantly if they espouse anything else? It is the same thing we see throughout almost all historians, let's just call it academia. Sorry, Scott. Within academia, there is an inability to accept I don't know. I don't know does not publish doctoral dissertations. I don't know is not an acceptable answer in academia. And on top of that, there is reputations, lives built on publication, right? You publish, you cannot then go back and say, well, I correct my prior. And in a culture, especially a Muslim culture that's very hierarchical, that's very traditional, they've built such a runway of saying, well, this is what must have happened, that there's no going back. From an academic standpoint, you just can't about face and say, we realize our entire view of ancient history was potentially wrong. And so they just dig down, and you just see the most adamant, bizarre. It's very similar to evolution. Evolution has been completely destroyed by the DNA code and other developments in the modern era, but yet you still see science saying, well, it must have happened because there's no alternative. That is the tomb theory. Well, it must be because there's no feasible alternative that fits within the narrative. And there's also the element of religion. Obviously, everyone knows Egypt is a Muslim nation. You can say what you want about the Muslims. They are unbelievably devout. As a people, no, not every single Muslim is perfectly devout, but as a people, you will not find more devout people on the planet Earth, including the Jews, who used to be that nature, that culture. They're not anymore. In modern Israel, it's not a religious state. Every single Muslim state is a religious state, and they adamantly hold. And so if there are things that are contrary to what are taught in their scriptures, if there are things that make you question long-held beliefs, it is a long-time tradition of just suppressing the information. And so that is, in the most simplified, unbelievably short terms, the reasons for sticking to this tomb and tomb-only theory. There really is no justification to support it.
There's also in Middle Eastern tend to favor logical, right?
Yeah, there's no prove it mentality. There's no demonstrate. Tradition is big. Like they'll hold an idea because it's tradition. That's a very Eastern way of thinking, and not just Near East, but Far East as well. You get into some of the Latino cultures, same way, not as much. There's more of an academic bent to it, but there is a high value placed on tradition in those societies, and it creates a barrier in the academic community because they have to fight all of the long-standing tradition if they want to change anything. We are used to a culture of anything goes, innovation, question everything, and so it's easy for us to go in and say, well, this is all obvious, and question it. You could be risking your life in some of these countries by coming forward with theories that counter the religious narrative. So it's a big deal, and I don't mean to make light of it. We're so used to questioning, and that's not true in what I would say most of the rest of the world, other than maybe Europe and North America. One of the big examples. Oh, good. Yep. Oh, go ahead. I'll try to stay on course.
Yes,
What's that?
but I don't know if the Muslims acknowledge the gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, which still have some.
Yeah.
Well, the Greeks and Romans have their own names for them, but Ra was the sun god, and Ishtar was the queen of heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but they've widely, openly embraced finding Egyptian relics and artifacts, things that show to the ancient Egyptian religion. That is no problem. They'll happily identify statues to Osiris, and that's just quaint remnants of antiquities. We're going to talk about it a little more, but there is more to it when you get into some of these that makes you question beliefs, and not just getting into, but you're absolutely right. There is a conflict between the official religion of place like Egypt, being Muslim, and the historic Egyptian culture and some of their gods. Just a very popular and well-known example of just blatant, outright and weird suppression. It has been understood throughout most of human history that there is a hole in the Sphinx's head, right? We're talking less than a half mile away from the Great Pyramid. There is a picture here in the black and white of an aerial photo from the 60s of the Sphinx's head showing the hole. This is the first drawn depiction from 1798 in the bottom of people climbing in and out of the Sphinx's head. A guy named Zahi Hawass is a brilliant Egyptologist. He became the head of the Department of Antiquities. He is probably one of the most knowledgeable historians to have walked the face of planet Earth, and has published more than most people could even dream of. And he has become the entrenched voice of traditional tomb and tomb only. Like he's so well known and so well published that he has basically taken on the role of being a gatekeeper to all other information in the nation of Israel, and he is insanely famous there for it. Egypt, in all of Egypt. I mean, he is like the beginning and end all. Like if you want to shoot a video at the Great Pyramid, he literally individually has to give approval even still. And so he takes on celebrity status there because he's been involved in so many big finds, big digs, just incredible guy, but very entrenched. There is a National Geographic special that shows him climbing into the tunnel in the Great Sphinx, and then they cut it after one episode. And then you can see here in the top left, the top was filled with concrete. You can see it filled. And to this day, Zahi Hawass will say there are no tunnels in the Great Sphinx. They just don't exist. That was a hoax. There are videos of him in the modern era when it's on YouTube going into them, and he was saying, no, that was a setup for publicity. There was never a tunnel there. There's no hole in the Sphinx set. You can literally fly over it and see modern concrete patch in the top of this thing's head, and yet the government will still say, no, there was never a hole. And so there's been all sorts of speculation about what was covered up, what was filled in there. That there's ideas that it was the famed Hall of Records. This is not limited to Egypt. There's a site in Turkey called Göbekli Tepe, which was recently found that gave insane evidence of historical civilizations that were completely contrary to what we've been taught in the Fertile Crescent, development of man, first Sumerians. They found so much there within the first months of discovering. A farmer is digging and discovers a giant rock, keeps digging and realizes it's a pillar of some kind, has some writing, reports it to the government. They excavated about 5% of it and then shut down all digging with the excuse that we want to save excavation of this site for future generations who have access to better technology to preserve the relics. You mean digging? Better technology than we have today in digging? That they just have absolutely shut it down and refuse to allow anyone to go any further. And only about 5% has been excavated. This is another site called Baalbek in Lebanon. There are stones at this Baalbek quarry that are close to 300 tons that are cut and dressed, that were cut and sealed for use in buildings. You can see pictures just to give you some scale of how big these are. And about a mile and a half away, they're 30 feet up on a structure, hoisted into place with perfect precision. We don't have cranes that can lift 300-ton blocks today. None. They don't exist. And this was in a time when supposedly they were using ropes and logs. Every piece of wood in that area is made of one of 3 different types of wood, all of which have a hardness rating that would be flattened by these stones in a second. Like, you couldn't line them up touching each other, they would be flattened. Supposedly these were rolled across mountains and placed in place 30 feet in the air. Yet when we try to excavate, they say, no, it's a Roman archaeological site. There was nothing else and won't allow continued excavation. The Romans had no such technology. There is no evidence anywhere within the Roman Empire of using stones anywhere close to this size, and they had no capability of moving it. Nothing we know justifies it, and they will not allow people to dig more. Now, you get into the real barriers. Anybody who questions any of the prior stories is branded, the weirdest thing of all, a racist. That is the term you see thrown around in this academic circle with these theories, because every one of them comes back to saying, nope, you're trying to prove that white people did this. That white people must have, it wasn't Egyptians that built the pyramid, it must have been white people. You don't have to espouse a theory about who built it. If you say it wasn't what the narrative is, you're racist. And you will see this thrown around so aggressively that it has ruined reputations, ruined careers, very militant. The ultimate irony of that is that, especially in Egypt, there is an incredible precedent of rewriting history to make them the central characters. If you've ever gone to an Egyptian museum or seen pictures, have you ever noticed that every statue is missing its nose? They all just happen to fall on their noses. That's always they were handled, and it's the part that protrudes. Okay, look in your bottom right. Look at the ears on that dude. And it's his nose that broke off. But they always say it fell and it broke. Look at the top middle one. That's a seated lion that weighs close to 2 tons. It didn't fall on its nose. That's a physical impossibility, right? And yet its nose is broken off. Okay? This is the statue of Ramses II when it was first discovered as buried in sand at the Valley of Kings in 1932. Notice the statues. Notice the features on the statues. This is them today after restoration initiatives. Do you notice anything different about their faces? One of them looks like Frank Thomas. Couldn't resist that. That's my childhood hero. Had to make him a pharaoh. That dude looks exactly like Frank Thomas. The guy on the right is whiter than I am. The reason they break off the noses is because the people who built were Africans. Imagine that. Africans in Africa, building things in Africa. And yet they rewrite history and have intentionally defaced the monuments to try to make them more Egyptian, make it more look like the people that are there now. That is a long-standing pastime. Go back to that picture we just had of the first drawing of the Sphinx. Look at the nose before it was broken off. Look at the lips. That is not an Egyptian. That is an African. No wonder they're defacing all the monuments. It's not a coincidence that the Sphinx is missing its nose. Its lips are gone, right? It's a progressive way of putting themselves into their own history. The Muslims were not in the nation when these things were built. There were Africans there. Go figure. Who would have guessed? I got to resist getting into my theory that everyone was dark-skinned at one point. If you play that out, there are no genetic defects that make you darker. You don't have two white people have a darker baby. Losing skin tone is a genetic thing. And so you have, it moves in that direction. It moves towards lighter. And so if you had all white people, where did the darker skin come from if we're going to play this game that the earth is only 7,000 years old? There's not enough time in 7,000 years to fully geneticize. It is common for a white, you can have two dark-skinned people who have an albino even. That's not unheard of. You put one in the genetic pool and all of a sudden you get lighter and lighter and lighter. You don't go towards darker and darker and darker. It just does not work with what we know of medicine. So all of our history, I believe, is rewritten to try to make it feel a little more like us. But, yep.
I think of Muslim as a religion. I didn't even think of it as race because I thought anyone could embrace the Quran, and doesn't that make them Muslim?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. It's more making the past look like the European image of an Egyptian, right? We have the pictures. You've seen pictures of what the Egyptians must have looked like back in the day, and you've seen pictures of it's romanticized in literature. It always has been. You've seen Charlton Heston playing Egyptians. You've seen even the Disney ones. What's the Prince of the Nile? Like you see, that's how we portray them. Cleopatra. That's not historically accurate. And so it's been a rewrite. And so that's why I find the argument of if you propose alternate theories, you are the one who are rewriting history to just be insanely ironic because they have stone evidence of doing the exact same thing. So all of that to say, and we're almost at an hour, something just doesn't add up. We're not quite at an hour. Okay. Something doesn't add up. You don't have to go so far as I do and say this ties to anything. You can stop at, man, the narrative that we're getting on human history doesn't match some places. There are problems. And you don't need to go any further, and even then, this gets interesting. But why do we care, right? Why are we doing this at a Bible study? Introduce Isaiah 19. I'm just going to read this because we're going to go quick. In that day, Egypt will be like a woman. In that day being a common prophetic reference towards the end time. And this specific passage is talking about a future time. Isaiah is prophesying during the divided kingdom. So after the Exodus, you can't lace this back and somehow make this about the Exodus. He's talking about a yet future time. In that day, Egypt will be like a woman who will be afraid and fear because of the waving of the hand of the Lord of hosts, which he waves over it, and the land of Judah will be a terror to Egypt. Everyone who makes mention of it will be afraid in himself because of the counsel of the Lord of hosts, which he has determined against us. In that day, there will be an altar to the Lord in the midst of the land of Egypt, and a pillar to the Lord at its border. It will be for a sign and for a witness to the Lord of hosts in the land of Egypt. For they will cry to the Lord because of the oppressions, and he will send them a Savior and a mighty one, and he will deliver them. Then the Lord will be known to Egypt, and the Egyptians will know the Lord in that day, and will make sacrifice and offerings. Yes, they make a vow to the Lord and perform it. This is what got me into all of this. I could not figure out what the heck does it mean by a pillar in the midst of Egypt and a monument on the border thereof. And I started going down a rabbit hole that I have been going down for 10 years now off of that verse. Just to break it down in the way we normally do, there will be an altar to the Lord. This is the common term that we see when Joshua, after the Battle of Jericho, builds an altar. When Moses crossed the Red Sea and builds an altar. These are sites commemorating something that God has done. The term, it's Mizbeach, and it refers to an actual religious altar, and a pillar that it uses is a similar term, Matzbeah, refers to a standing stone that's set up to commemorate something. It's a monument. It's better translated monument, and everywhere else but here in the King James, it's translated a monument to my name. In the biblical context, these stones are often commemorated significant events. It's used 15 other times. So there is going to be an altar in the midst of Egypt and a monument on the border thereof, and it will be a witness. It will be both a sign and a witness. Those are specific terms. Those are not arbitrary. A sign is something that has tangible indication of something that's happened. A sign is a physical thing. A witness is something that actively tells. So it will be both a memorialization of something, a standing, and it will have an active testimony. It will witness to something. And those terms are very specifically used throughout the Bible. So that should raise the question, because this is sort of a conundrum. How can something be in the midst of Egypt and also on its borders? Aren't those two things opposites? What we don't have and what they do have, even in Egypt today, is Egypt is divided and has been divided into Lower and Upper Egypt. Weirdly, Lower is north of Upper because it goes in the direction that the Nile flows. But Lower Egypt, the capital in the ancient times, was Thebes, Memphis, and then Upper Egypt was the capital of Thebes. They had two different capitals, two different governments, and one pharaoh over both. And he wore two hats, where he was the pharaoh of Upper and Lower during the unified kingdom. The line that goes between Upper and Lower passes right through Cairo. And it is the word for border in Arabic and Egyptian is Giza or Giza. So the city of Giza, where the pyramid is, literally means the edge or the border. So there is one place in Egypt that is on the border and yet still in the midst. And it happens to have a giant, unexplainable monument in the midst of it. Go figure. So that's where I got fascinated again. Because we know that there will be two or more witnesses, Jeremiah also says, and this is just a snippet from it, you have set signs and wonders in the land of Egypt, even to this day, and you have made yourself a name, as it is on this day. Psalms also talks about a witness coming out of Egypt in the last days. I don't know if they're related, but this is where things get very, very weird. And so if you brought your tinfoil hat, please feel free to put it on. There are numerous texts and books that refer to the Great Pyramid as the Bible in stone, as the stone witness. I have made a collection of all the biblically oriented books about the Great Pyramid. The theory, and we're going to test this a little bit, is the course of human history is coded into the Great Pyramid in a shocking way. This is not just a Bible thing. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is sort of the ancient Egyptian sacred text, describes different pathways. There are different pathways to the afterlife, one being a descending, one being an ascending, or two that are ascending, one being an ascending, and it describes these, and they long held, the Egyptians and even the modern historians, that this was a map of the Great Pyramid, that the Great Pyramid was built to reflect the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which has the descending corridor, the chamber of chaos or chamber of fire, the hall of truth, the hall of truth in darkness, which leads to the hall of truth in life or in light, and then the chamber of second chances and the chamber of the resurrection. Those are the recognized, what's that?
What was the last one?
The king's chamber is referred to as the chamber of resurrection. So there's rebirth and resurrection, the lower chamber being rebirth or second chance, and the upper. There is a prophetic timeline that's played off of the Book of the Dead. There's several books written about this that trace back to ancient antiquities that had the end of all things somehow, without explaining how, based on the chronology of the Great Pyramid, the end of all things in 2038. So similar to what we saw in the Mayan calendars, they had a date where they expected the end of all things. The Egyptian tradition was that based on this timeline within the Great Pyramid, the end of all things would be 2038. And that has nothing to do with our modern stuff. That was just a historical reference. So I have to take a minute to do the unit of measurement. That one other feature that I told you beside the scored line is this boss symbol. There is just a horseshoe-shaped thing in the midst of an otherwise plain wall that sticks out. Unexplainable until they figured out that was the unit of measurement on which this whole thing has been built. Once they used that as the unit of measurement, they started looking at the sides and found that the sides weren't 226.65 meters. They were 1,000 cubits to the inch. And so they determined that's the standard by which this is measured. That cubit is the same sacred cubit that's used in the building of the tabernacle. It is the only other reference to the sacred cubit that we have in historians' record. Otherwise, the normal cubit that's used elsewhere is 27 inches. There's a 25-inch cubit that's referred to as the sacred cubit. 1 inch of that, 1/25 of that, is referred to as a pyramid inch. And so that becomes this concept in measuring the whole thing in inches. We now know it was made in cubits, but you can break that down into the smaller component of 1/25 of a cubit and get the inch. And that is the sacred cubit. These are all the books that I have on this chronology. And I add these here only to tell you I am not crazy. I'm a little bit crazy. I'm not the only one. This is fairly, there are a lot of other crazies throughout history. And the first such crazy in 1909 was a guy named Davidson, and he had a couple others. We lost our first one. That's sad. Not unexpected, though. As soon as we start talking about the chronology, people are just going to flee for the door. Yeah. Davidson, Smith, and Piazzi were around the same time period, 1909 to 1930, and they measured this thing with strings, right? They were in there in the dark with flames in a corridor where they could only be in for minutes at a time before they smoked themselves out, measuring this thing with string to the inches. And they came, as they started doing that, they started at these lines that were the dating, and they started recognizing some trends. And so using what they had learned from the Book of the Dead, they said, well, this starts to look kind of like the story of salvation. And so they were Christians, and this started to sound a little familiar. And they theorized first, well, maybe the descending chamber represents natural man. The first ascending chamber is the path of the Jews that cuts off. And then the final grand gallery represents the church. And that was before they started measuring. They took and implemented, if you've heard of Ussher's dates, Ussher was a bishop who basically used the 360-day year and charted out every reference to a date in the Bible. He begat him, and made a chronology that is still to this day the standard of use in most. If you bought a timeline of the Bible, you're probably still using Ussher's dates. They started throwing Ussher's dates down in pyramid inches and started finding some really alarming things. Starting from the one dating line that's well established, they found that the first chamber starts at 1486 inches, which is the year of the Exodus in Ussher's dates. Going up, the law is given in 1460, and that's the start of the granite plug. The end of the granite plug is 1380, which is the start of the period of the judges. That continues on. Then there's a division within the chamber where you see these corbels come through, and that's at 1080, which is the date of the divided kingdom of Israel, and it goes up, and this ends at 33 on the calendar, if you're converting these to pyramid inches, which starts the Grand Gallery. 33 AD being significant as the probable year of the crucifixion. And then you get this other corridor that branches off. It opens up at 70 AD, which is the year of the diaspora, of the dispersion of the Jews, the destruction of Israel that was prophesied by Christ, and it ends in the Queen's Chamber and at the inch of 1948, which is the year that Israel was established as a nation. And so if you're going to play this thing as, well, that's another path, that room is called the chamber of second chances under the Day of the Dead. If that's not a summary of God's prophetic plan for Israel, I don't know what is. You continue on, the ascending corridor, this is where Davidson stopped because he thought the world was going to end in 1979. And so they made the proposal that it was going to stop right at the end of this grand step. But he does a little footnote because the limestone continues and the granite doesn't start yet. In his footnote, he notes that the granite starts at 2038, which is probably where they got the date. And that's just a footnote to his text. So he notices that limestone continues on this trajectory to 2038 and says, well, that's probably where that prophecy came from. But the world's still ending in 1979. Clearly, got to go back. We have 2004 to 25, total collapse of materialist civilization. 2014 to 2032, a spiritual low point among mankind at large. 2025, partial reestablishment of civilized society. And then 2034, appearance in the sky of the sign of the Messiah. 2039, the Christos incarnates in a physical man and long-awaited messianic return. And so that was his interpretation of the rocks. And so I don't know what to do with that. Again, is this gospel? Are you going to go out and make converts to the Lord, accept Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior because the pyramid is incredibly precise on the timeline and it's all going to end in 2038? No, that's not at all what I'm espousing. I do not think this rises to the level of biblical truth, and I don't know, and nor do I care if that's accurate, and it's all going to come to an end. But is it nothing? Is that just pure coincidence? Is it coincidence that they, in ancient Egypt, had a theory of how these chambers would work and it came to a single date, and yet we can chart out the major events of the Bible in inches in this piece of stone that was built and seems to be referenced in Isaiah? It's all a lot.
Well, especially since it wasn't built in inches.
Exactly. It's just this weird, well, I mean, it was built in these units of measurement. It's pyramid inches we're using, 1/25 of a cubit.
Okay.
So is this what he was talking about in Isaiah? Is this the fulfillment, a timeline? Is it meant to be that's what the witness and in 2038 we'll all know? Maybe, but I don't think so. I think there's a lot more to this. There's some other wonky things going on. The coffer that's in the granite chamber has the exact cubic volume of the Ark of the Covenant. Weird. The interior of the king's chamber is 20 by 40 cubits, which is the tabernacle without the Holy of Holies. 20 by 40 sacred cubits is the size of the tabernacle, excluding the Holy of Holies. So you've got a box in there that's the size of the Ark of the Covenant that has the same metric volume as the Ark of the Covenant in a room that's the same size as the primary part of which you wouldn't replicate the Holy of Holies. So it weird. Again, what the heck does that mean? I have no idea. But it's another one of those things that's odd. I don't believe there's been years and years of questing for the Ark of the Covenant, and people believe it was in the Great Pyramid at some point. The reason I don't think so, nor do I have any interest in looking or care for the Ark of the Covenant, is because Jeremiah 3:16 says the Ark will come no more into remembrance. The Ark is not to be remembered. It was intentionally set aside by God because they were making it an idol. They were worshiping the Ark and not the God of the Ark, and so he sets it aside. What he does not set aside is the mercy seat. And that we talked about, I believe the mercy seat is yet to come. I believe that's coming out of Ethiopia. We've talked about that in the study. I think it's being held in Axum, Ethiopia. They probably don't know what they have, but they are waiting for the Messiah to present this thing that they have to the Messiah. And I believe that's the throne that he will rule from, and super interesting history on that. And I know we did a full study on that at some point. There's also the Coptic traditions. About 10% of the Egyptian population is Coptic. That's their nationality, but it's also a religious designation. They are Christians, but they are ultra-Orthodox Christians. They date back to the 600s. Very traditional style of Christianity, even more akin to Greek Orthodox than even Catholicism. They have some very weird traditions about the Great Pyramid. They call it the Pillar of Enoch. No idea why. They believe that the stones were floated into place on sheets of paper using resonant harmonics. So singing. They were, and this is the tradition of this group. And it was done prior to the flood, and that they were placed using some bizarre technology that understood earth sciences. I won't go into all of the Coptics traditions, but I have come to a place where I don't discard traditions. Traditions come from somewhere. Are they gospel? No. But they have a basis in something. And some of the things, if you ever get a chance to just look at what the Coptics believe about the Great Pyramid, it is very, very religious. And it is very closely tied to Christianity. So they have some very interesting beliefs. Again, another marker that makes me think, that's about all it does. Yep.
If I understood you correctly, some people say that, or Einstein said that part of the measurement is the distance of Earth to the sun.
Oh, Newton. Newton was saying,
Excuse me,
yeah.
but doesn't the distance between the Earth and the sun vary during the year?
The distance shouldn't. We should stay in orbit to it. It's got to vary by miles. But we're on a straight elliptical. No, yeah, we're on a straight elliptical of it. I mean, where we are as compared to it, we're tilted and such, but we should stay on it. And it's got to change. The number is in millions of miles. So I'm sure it does change by hundreds, but we're talking like 9.7 million miles or something like that. And they come to a 9.7. So that one should be a constant. But again, that was one of the ones I flagged at the beginning of saying, this one's fishy to me because it's always measured in meters, and that's not a unit of measurement in the. So, yeah, I'm happy to throw that one away. Okay.
Well, it seems that I have heard missionaries say that when they go into an area and they're talking with people who have different beliefs than what's in the scriptures, that they embrace the beliefs related to the scripture and bring their own stuff with it and intermix it.
Yeah.
And it's a problem.
Yeah, we talked about that a lot with the Apocrypha, like some of the apocryphal books, some of the like side books that become canonical, like it can really distort. And that's why I say I would never put weight on any of those, and I would never, the tradition shouldn't influence canon. Like, what? Well, yeah, I was going to try not to get into that. I was trying to avoid that one. But I 100% agree with you. Like when you're talking about doctrine, when you're talking about, you cannot allow tradition to influence your interpretation of Scripture. I only raise this as like a weird. Where do they come up with this idea that they call this Egyptian thing the Pillar of Enoch? Why is it tied to that? Where are these ideas that are so wonky that they don't even seem like they could be made up, that it was floated into place on sheets of paper? Not just very tangential to what we're doing here. The real wild part of this starts in 2002. As I mentioned, there are air shafts that go into the main chambers. The ones coming out of the Queen's chamber do not surface. They don't make it through to the surface. The ones coming out of the King's chamber go all the way to the surface and keep a constant airflow. They realized the ones from the Queen's chamber didn't. And so in 2002, a group sent a robot that was custom made to go up this air shaft to see what was at the end of it and see where it stops. It goes up the air shaft and gets to what is now referred to as Gattenbrink's door. Gattenbrink's door has 2 bronze handles 1,000 years before the Bronze Age. They found bronze handles on this door at the end of the chamber, and it is not tied to any known opening in the pyramid that we know of. It's off in the middle of stone. That's all the farther they got in 2002. In 2005 or 2010, they came back with a more advanced robot that drills a hole in the door, pokes a probe through, and has a little spinny camera, and observed some markings and then a second door. So right behind it, it was a small chamber and then a second door. Immediately, the Egyptian government came and shut it down. They shut down the entire thing as soon as they saw the markings. The project has never been reopened. Our good friend Zawi Hawass is in charge of cutting things off. One of the really interesting things they did observe is there's salt sediments and deposits the entire length of those air shafts. That's weird. And it's salt that's consistent with seawater in the shafts. Fast forward to 2015, no progress made examining the shafts. No progress probably will ever be made as long as the government has anything to say with it. They've shut that down entirely. But they started what's called the Scan Pyramid Project in 2015, where they started placing various forms of sonar, heat radar, all sorts of measuring devices in various instruments throughout, or in various openings in the pyramid, and then all around the outside using satellite imaging. And they used 12 different means of measuring and then compared results to try to find anomalies within the structure, to try to find any other hidden chambers. What they found is probably the most astounding find in history in the last 1,000 years. There is another chamber with a 99.9 to 7 digits % degree accuracy. So statistically impossible to be wrong that there's nothing there. That's from 2015, that there was an anomaly that was bigger than the King's Chamber and about the size of the Grand Gallery on the off course above the Grand Gallery, and another small entrance chamber right at the entrance, called very creatively the Big Void and the Small Void. Now, then in 2021, they redid the scans and again reaffirmed with better technology, nano scanning, and affirmed there is a giant chamber above the Grand Gallery within the pyramid, and there's no records, no possible way of knowing what's in there, and the Egyptian government will not take any steps to examine it. They've fielded proposals from every major university in the area about how they could do it with scoping devices, drilling minimal boring holes. They drill into this thing 20 times a year. They drill into the core of the Great Pyramid just to check stability, to make sure people can go inside. And their response was, no, we can't do that because we can't risk drilling and damaging the infrastructure. They literally punch holes in this thing multiple times a year to check for fidelity. And they won't even send a camera in to see what's in there. That's bizarre, but they know there is an undiscovered chamber within the Great Pyramid. Now, couple that with what we read in Isaiah, where there is something going to happen. There is going to be a monument in the last days that testifies to the Lord and serves as a witness to him. May it be that there is something in there that offers irrefutable proof that what is in the Bible, that the claims about Jehovah, the Christian God, are true. That, I feel, is more likely than the chronology. I think the chronology is impressive and very cool to study. I think this could be unbelievable. Like the amount, you couldn't even fathom the damage it would do it to all other religions if there was something in there that verified the Christian story. So that's where I think that's going. It begs the question, then who built this thing, right? Then, I mean, you got to kind of go back in history, and the answer to that is, I don't know. And anybody who tells you otherwise is absolutely lying and intellectually dishonest. If you think you know with certainty what happened 4,000 years ago because you are examining a stone structure today, which is the position of modern archaeology, the Egyptian government, that they absolutely know and there can be no possible variance. No, we don't know. You can't possibly know, and there are too many anomalies to even start to hazard a guess as to how. That being said, and I love the Einstein quote, the more I learn, the more I realize how much I don't know. And that has been like the summary of my study in the Great Pyramid. The more I get into it, the more I'm just like, we have no clue all the crazy features of this thing. Yep.
I think it's incredibly ironic that we think we're so smart, but when we look at the handiwork of ancient people, they're thinking about many of the same things, life and death, that we do, and incredibly smarter.
Primitive savages, obviously, right? Like, I mean, that's the narrative, is that these were simplistic people wearing loincloths and pulling ropes, and that's your explanation on how you get something like this? You have to be kidding me. Like, your picture is one guy that's wearing clothes, whipping a bunch of guys in loincloths that pull ropes, and you built the Great Pyramid? That's your explanation of human history? You don't look at this and say, that is a marvel. We don't know half. Like, we don't know what's going on. It should inspire you if you look at something like that to say, what the heck? You can't possibly have the answers. And to have the arrogance to say, well, I know it must have been exactly what we think happened, is beyond me. And so that's when I say, I don't know what happened. There are things I do know. I do know it was built before the age of written record. There is nothing written anywhere that says how it was built. So I can limit a time frame before the age of written record. I know the builders possess some form of strength or knowledge that vastly exceeds our current limitations. We could not build this thing today. With the technology, the mechanical advances, the computers, the direction that technology has gone in, that we've developed, we could not build this today. And I know it is something far greater than a dead man's grave. Like, those are the framework within which I can hazard a guess. I will not be so arrogant to say I think this is what happened, but I know those things are true. And when I get to that point, I feel like it's pretty safe to go to the Bible and see, does the Bible offer some help, right? That's kind of my process with everything. And if you remember our Genesis 6 study, do we know anything about the period before there was written record, when maybe people with unusual strength and knowledge were on the face of the earth, that's permissible within the framework of the Bible? Sure enough, we find, and it came to pass, the men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God, the Benaiah Elohim, saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took wives of all of them which they chose. And the Lord said, my spirit shall not always strive with men, for he also is flesh, and yet the days shall be 120 years old. There were giants. The term used is the Nephilim. And if you remember our Hebrew, that I am ending is the plural in Hebrew. Cherubim, seraphim, that just means plural. So this is Nephal, Nephil, which just means the fallen ones. There were fallen ones in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became the mighty men, which were of old, men of renown. The term Rephaim, again, is a plural of Rapha, which means mighty men. So it's just the mighty ones. And so when we see these giants in the land in Joshua, it's the same term. It's this Rephaim. It's the result of this, the fallen ones cohabitating with human women results in these mighty men. It is no coincidence. This is not a uniquely Christian idea. This is something that permeates every culture on the face of the planet, that at some point in human history there were half God, half men, the Titans, the demigods. Even whether it's Native Americans, like the South American, Incan, and Aztec cultures, they all have these concepts of there historically being half men and of unusual size and capability. Again, I would dismiss it if the Bible didn't say that's exactly what happened. So prior to the flood, what we don't really think about as we work through this is the timeline puts that somewhere in the generations of Seth. And again, we're having to look at some outside sources, so that's not going to be definite. That's not biblical. Book of Enoch says that that's extra biblical. It's just used for what they believed at the time. And traditions of the Jews say that the fallen ones cohabitated during the time of Seth. So if we throw that on here, time of Seth, let's just call it 3,500, that leaves 1,100 years before the flood that they were inhabiting the earth. If you had mighty men, giants roaming the lands, fallen angels cohabitating for 1,000 years on planet Earth, can you imagine the construction works and the megaliths they'd be capable of doing? What we see in our geological record, in our architectural, is absolutely in line with what the Bible said happened. And so therefore, I have no problem believing that there were a race of beings capable of building something like this and had technologies and advances, because the Bible says that's what happened. These aren't big, who built it, to me is far less important than the fact that this thing will testify of God in the coming years. But even then, I just don't have any problem fitting what we're seeing in Göbekli Tepe and the Baalbek stones in the Incan pyramids with steps that are 10 feet tall in a staircase. This fits within the record of what we have seen, what we have been told of prehistory, if you'll call it. Could they be even older? The big push now is you've used carbon dating and it's become a big thing. There's a guy named Graham Hancock who's pretty prolific in this space, and he has a really persuasive theory that these megaliths all consistently date to about 12,000 years ago, and then there was a cataclysmic event that changed the face of the earth, and man had to restart. And so he dates this ice age, and it's become really a prevalent thought. Is that possible within the framework of the Bible? Maybe. Hooligans.
A creation of the earth, a creation of man. What is
Exactly. Can you fit the idea that there may be structures that are here that go back farther, saying man was created at 4,000 or at 6,000 years ago and 4,000? Is it possible that there are structures on the face of the earth that predate men, that predate creation as we know it, that predate humanity? And as anyone who has been in the study knows, for a while, I'm a believer in the gap theory. I believe in taking the Bible on face value when it says something specific, taking it as it says. And Genesis 1:1 seems to indicate that the earth was made originally by God, and then it was rendered into a condition of being lifeless and without form and substance. Even so much so that he goes in and later verifies that God creates nothing tohu vabohu, nothing without form and substance. So when he created it, it was created to be inhabited. It was not created without form and substance. But the Hebrew that's used is that it was rendered without form and substance. And what we know of the angels, that term is so hard to use because we think of them as these spirit beings and such, but they have the same promises, the same eternal existence with God that we do. There is perfectly within the framework of Scripture that they could have existed here, been wiped out in a cataclysmic event, the earth sat dormant, and then God recreates. God creates again. God does not change. I do not believe that I am the center of his creative works. I don't believe that I am the last being he's ever going to create to demonstrate love. I don't believe I'm the first being he's ever created to demonstrate love. I believe he has done this before. He will continue to do this after our existence. We are not the center of the universe. We are part of a loving God's plan. And his ultimate destiny for us is the earth will be consumed in a fervent heat and will be taken away. I think he'll just start over in the same way. So I could see, if, let's call it 12,000 years, it's possible that there was an existence on this earth. It was wiped clean of life, and then God started over in his creative life, his creative acts. That does not violate my view of God being the creator and God being sovereign and God creating the heavens and the earth and doing all the things he said. I don't have a problem with a timeline like that. I have a problem with millions of years. then you start needing those millions of years for different purposes. But if you want to say, hey, we found stones that we can date flora that we don't know or fauna that we can't identify back 12,000 years, and it appears these were made right before a cataclysmic event and prior to any written record, I say, cool, that's possible, right? It could have been not us that made them, and they could be rocks that were sitting on the earth. They're big rocks. They're going to survive. They're 300-ton rocks. I have no problem believing whatever cataclysm befell the earth, they were still sitting there being rocks. And so,
How did they figure how long ago they were made?
no idea. Some of it's so circular. Some of it's like we date the strata of the rock, and then, well, we know that's 10,000 years old. Well, how do you know? Because the plants that are around it are 10,000 years. Well, how do you know they're 10,000 years? Well, because they were on the rock, the 10,000-year-old rock, you idiot. So some of it's, but again, I don't
have a problem with, you're saying it could be,
yeah.
but I don't put any stock in the way they figure that.
Nope, me neither. I stick to a young Earth theory. I stick to 6,000 years of creation.
The same thing with your Bronze Age and different ages. That's them wanting to categorize it and have. It's like when they used to teach us in science that it was layers of this.
Exactly.
And it's not.
The geological strata.
It's not like that.
And then you see it change in one lifetime. You see reshifting of New Mexico geological strata in a single lifetime, but they said it took 1 million years. Yeah, I'm in the same boat. I guess where I'm getting, if someone came to Graham Hancock's theory is really persuasive, really incredible, and he came and said, there's great evidence that it was 12,000. These are 12,000 years old, and we see consistent evidence in different geological sites. No problem. Sure, that fits, and I try to approach everything with, can I fit that within the framework of the Bible? I believe I can. I believe that could make sense. Do I think that's the case? No, probably not. But it works. I can't fit 1 million years. I can't fit 50 million years or 1 billion years of evolution. I will have, but yeah, I don't. So I think that all of these things line up with what we would expect to see from a biblical standpoint, and further just kind of validate for me the excitement that there is a mystery. There is this thing that has existed for dang near, 4,500 years that has sat there that God may have a purpose for in being a testimony. I could be entirely wrong about all of this. He could have been referencing literally like a mound of rocks that's a monument in Egypt that'll start talking and singing praises, and it has nothing to do with the pyramid. I don't care. This has drawn me into the Word. Like, this is something that has caused me to get into the Bible. If you get on a tangent that causes you to start questioning the Bible, then not beneficial. But for me, this has been one of those things that has just been a validation of faith for someone who just loves the idea of there being archaeological mysteries out there, and that God is at work and that he's going to use these incredible things that you can go physically see. And so that's the reason it's become my magnificent obsession over the last 10 years. It's just, I love the idea that there is something mystical, that there is a reminder that we are not all we think we are, that we don't have the answers. You will never convince me that we have the answers when you go look at that structure. You don't know anything. You don't know 10% of what you think you know about human history. Go stand in that building and tell me you have a clue what happened during those times. It's just, it's such a humbling and I don't know. That's the reason I love it. It's, as I said, you either come out of looking at this and say, oh my gosh, I got to look at more. I got to look up this and watch all the YouTube videos and stuff. Or you go, yeah, it's cool. It's a big pile of rocks. And go on with your life. But I don't know. I'm glad I get to share it, and it's fun to talk about and dream about and put the slides together. So appreciate letting me do that. This has been something I wanted to go through for a long time. So.